I will tell you that I couldn't do my job in a pandemic without Sefaria. And I know that a lot of my rabbinic colleagues feel the same way. So if you are moved to financially support their work, it's basically like the Wikipedia of Judaism, and it just gets better every day. It's really an incredible resource. So you can sign up for a free account, and they have actually English commentaries on the Mishna in abundance. So if you really want to go down some rabbit holes, or perhaps drop the T and make that rabbi holes, you can avail yourselves of the robust archives on Sefaria, or just do what I also recommend. This is not an either or, but a both and. Get yourselves a nice copy of Pirkei Avot. As you can see, it's a very slim volume. The one that I'm using is the Koren Pirkei Avot. Koren is a Jewish publishing house based in Jerusalem. They've just completed the publication of a landmark 42-volume Adin Steinsaltz's translation of the Babylonian Talmud, which I've been collecting over the last 7 or 8 years. I finally just got volume 42, so I'm very excited. It's the first time I've actually owned a Babylonian Talmud. It only took me 20 years as a rabbi to get one. It's an investment, of course, but I highly recommend getting a copy of the Koren Pirkei Avot, or there's some other modern editions, and I've emailed you about that. By way of our usual housekeeping, let me remind you that our class is being recorded, so you can adjust your video and audio settings accordingly. Also, know that today is the second to last Mishna session with me for some time. So our final fall semester class will take place on the 10th. There will not be class on the 17th, 24th, or after the New Year, or on the 31st. But never fear, there's plenty of rich adult engagement and learning happening at WRT. You just need to check the weekly electronic newsletter and the website, and stay tuned, because we are adding new programming all the time, including, please mark your calendars, and this will be in the Temple's e-blast this morning. But please mark your calendars for an exclusive conversation with the Consul General of the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates to our Westchester Jewish community. That will take place over Zoom on Tuesday, the 29th of December at 1:00 p.m. I will have the pleasure of welcoming the Consul General of the UAE, and a conversation moderated by Mr. Nadav Shachmon, our Westchester Shaliach, will engage with our guest, Mr. Shaheen, who is one of the top diplomats from the United Arab Emirates, and he will hold forth with our community on the normalization of relations between the Gulf state of the UAE and Israel. It's going to be a really interesting hour online. Registration is free, but you do have to register for security purposes. We don't want any cyber security incidents, so you'll be asked to disclose the usual, your name, phone number, and email, and that will give you a Zoom registration link that will allow you to enjoy a conversation with this important diplomat. I'm really looking forward to that. Again, that's going to be Tuesday, the 29th of December, this month, at 1:00 p.m. And while I'm in housekeeping mode, kind of getting a few other announcements and things to look out for out of the way, next week begins Hanukkah. So we actually have a mix of online and in-person celebratory events for Hanukkah starting next Thursday night, and for each of the evenings of Hanukkah. Just look to the website, and again, pay attention to the e-blast. We're targeting different parts of our community. So some nights are going to be for families with little children. Some nights are going to be for the community at large. There's going to be community candle lighting after online services next Friday night. So the Friday night of Hanukkah, the Shabbat of Hanukkah, will have online Shabbat services, and then an outdoor, brief but lovely candle lighting ceremony in the roundabout lot behind the main building in front of the CJL. So there's a little something to spread some holiday cheer almost every night of Hanukkah. So we're not treating December as a slow season. Similarly, while I'm on sabbatical, in addition to the bi-weekly classes taught by the amazing Israeli professor Rachel Korazim, and I know some of you have already started tuning into those classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays on great Israeli poets, both modern and classical. You'll have opportunities to experience the teaching and gifts of our cantorial team. So just stay tuned. We're kind of planning 2 months at a time right now. And finally, saving the best for last, I would love to see as many of you as can make it tonight at 8 o'clock for a mid-year check-in, mid-Jewish year that is. That will be hosted online, and temple leadership, both lay and professional, will be present. So I'll be joined by my clergy colleagues and by our executive director, Ellie Kornreich, temple president, Marcy Harris, members of the board and the executive committee. And we will offer a bit of an overview of where WRT is at from an operational standpoint, from a financial standpoint. We'll have some reflections on how we have managed during this unprecedented time as a congregational community, what our hopes and dreams are for the coming months or year ahead, and also what some of the challenges are going to be. And there's time for Q&A. We'll ask that either you submit your questions in advance or you can use the chat function to type your questions in rather than, we're not going to do open mic night. We just find that it's actually not the most effective way of sharing our thoughts and hearing reflections. So I'll look forward to having that conversation with you tonight. And if you want to put in a good word about how much you've been enjoying Mishna class, go ahead and say it tonight. I'm sure other people in the congregation would like to be reminded that despite the fact that our building is not open all the time, the community is actually deeply engaged in living our Judaism. So thank you. With that in mind, I'm going to admit a few more people from the waiting room. We have nice attendance this morning. Let's say our bracha for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And with that, we're off and running. I don't think I need to do too much catching up from where we left off last time. What I would like to do is simply remind us that we are in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, which is all about the relationship between teachers and their disciples. And in order to get caught up from, or to kind of be prepared for the material we're going to look at today, which is a direct continuation of where we left off, we've been looking at pairs of sages who, the rabbis tell us in Pirkei Avot, inherit the tradition from their teachers. So there's this intention to present to the reader a clear and linear chain of tradition, a phrase that in Hebrew is rendered shalshelet hakabbalah, the chain of Jewish tradition. We had an interesting digression a couple of weeks ago where I shared with you that my preferred metaphor for Jewish tradition is not a chain, but a rope. Because in a chain, if a single link breaks, the whole thing falls apart. But with a rope made up of innumerable twisted, interconnected fibers, even when individual fibers break off or are interrupted, the rope can hold fast. And I think that that's the beautiful thing about Judaism. It actually is a multi-fibered rope that is durable, in part because of the multiplicity of voices that inform our tradition. So think of it as a rope. Even though the rabbis of Pirkei Avot clearly want you to have in mind a chain, the rabbis want to do that, I believe, because they want to shore up their own authority as the arbiters of the tradition, the interpreters of the law. And they want to make it clear that even though it was Moses alone who went up Sinai to receive the law from the very mouth of God, Moses is only the beginning of a chain of transmission of revelation, that divine communication that began at Sinai, but which is transmitted orally, and at least if you take the rabbis at their word, is not significantly less authoritative than the written Torah. I mean, it is and it isn't. The rabbis want to make it clear that they now hold the authority to dictate matters of Jewish law and practice to the Jewish community. And so these rabbis, who are the voices that inform Pirkei Avot, are throughout chapter 1 explaining, and we would say in colloquial parlance, they're giving props to, they're paying their respects to their teachers. And so we see that in pairs generally, teachers are named, acknowledged, and given teachings that are attributed to them, which largely in this chapter have to do with the relationship between teachers and students. The only other thing about which I wish to remind us is what the signature qualities or qualifications of the rabbi in ancient society. And those are to be, on the one hand, teacher, and on the other hand, judge. And if you logged on the early side today, you saw that I was schmoozing with Her Honor, Carole Princer Levy, who also understands the role of judge, having been a judge. And we have to assume that in ancient Jewish society, there is no separation of church and state. So there's no such thing as a secular judicial authority. The religious judicial authorities are the civil or secular judicial authorities, and that matters of Jewish law and practice are not relegated exclusively to the realm of ritual or holidays, but rather are comprehensive. And all the proof of that you would ever need is in the structure of the Mishna itself. And the Mishna does not talk only about things that we 21st century Jews think about as religious issues. It also talks about torts. It talks about, business dealings. It talks about family law and marital law and divorce law. And so while the framework may be halachic, which is the Jewish word for legal, Jewish legal, it is intended to be comprehensive, right? It's not supposed to be just Judaism is the thing you do in shul or in your home, but when you're in the street, you abide by a different set of laws. Obviously, for the great preponderance of Jewish history, we have found ourselves subject to both law, right? Both laws. We've been Jews who have been subject to the halakha, but we have also been residents under non-Jewish regimes, many of which were also not secular. For most of European Jewish history, we were subjects effectively of the Catholic Church. Jews living in France, for instance, France was a theocratic state basically run by the Pope, and his bishops. So I think it's just important for us to realize that some of the assumptions we have about jurisprudence in our secular American society should not be transferred onto how we read these texts about the role of the rabbi as judge. So the rabbi served as both judge and teacher for the Jewish community. With that in mind, let's actually do some reading of Pirkei Avot. We've said our bracha, so I'm going to just bring up onto the screen exactly where we left off, which was Pirkei Avot chapter 1, verse 7. And as always, I like to start with a little bit of the Hebrew, not to intimidate, but rather to encourage. Nitai ha'arbeli, Omer. Nitai the Arbelite. Now, what's an Arbelite? Well, an Arbelite is a person from Arbel. Arbel is a community in the southern Galilee. So northern Israel, but on the south side of the shores of the Sea of Galilee, which is really a big lake up in the northern part of Israel along the Jordan River. So Nitai from Arbel used to say, Omer says, but used to say, Harchek mishachen ra, distance yourself from an evil neighbor. Mishachen ra literally means an evil companion or an evil neighbor, a bad guy. V'al titchaber l'rasha, and do not associate, or literally this word titchaber means to attach yourself. Here they translate it as do not become attached to, l'rasha, to a wicked person, to the wicked. The word inside of titchaber is chaver. You can see it because I'm circling it with my cursor. Chaver is a word you might have heard. Chaver means a friend. or an associate, but it comes from a verb meaning to connect or join. Chaver became, I think, a popular word in the American Jewish consciousness when Yitzhak Rabin was murdered 25 years ago last month, and Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, memorably bid him farewell with the words, Shalom Chaver, goodbye, friend. So, tit chaber, don't become friends with somebody who's bad news. Don't become friends with a rasha. Rasha, by the way, the same word that we find in the Haggadah for the wicked child. So do not associate with somebody who is bad news. Ve'al tityaesh, do not give up hope. Right? Tityaesh literally means abandon or shun. Do not give up hope. Min hapur anut. Do not give up your hope or your faith in punishment. These are often, these teachings, and I said this the last time we were together 2 weeks ago, usually take the form of a threefold maxim, right? So the maxim or the proverb or the byword that's being shared by the teacher in the text is usually in the form of three, seems to be a very common mnemonic device for inculcating the text in the minds of the disciples, for whom they probably were not, when these teachings were originally being communicated in the BCE period. Nitai Ha'arbalite, the Arbalite, is said to have lived at the time of King Alexander Yannaeus, or John Alexander. Alexander Yannaeus was a Jewish monarch who was a direct descendant of the Hashmonai family, the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans may not be a name that immediately comes to mind, but they are very much relevant at this time of year because they are better known to us as the Maccabees. So the Maccabees overthrew they combated a conquest, an insurrection. They were an insurrection force against the regional governor, whose name, of course, was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, is his nickname, which means the one to whom God reveals. So Antiochus, who was this puppet governor set up by the Greek regime, the Hellenistic regime in what is today Syria, called the Seleucid Empire, which was a rival to the other Greek puppet state in the south of Israel, to the south of Israel, which were the Ptolemies, PT as in pterodactyl, the Ptolemies, who were the ruling power in Egypt at the time. So the Seleucids at the time, ruled by Antiochus, we're going back to the first quarter, the early 2nd century BCE, so the 170s. Was the Maccabean uprising. It was a band of zealous country priests, a bunch of rural family of the family name Hashmonai, therefore called the Hasmoneans, and Mattathias, the head of the family, and his sons, most prominently Judah, better known as Maccabee, Judah Hashmonai, Judah Maccabee, the Hasmonean, led an insurrection against the assimilationist government of Israel, which they basically felt were in bed with the Seleucids. And they were particularly antagonized by Antiochus, who, among other things, outlawed certain core Jewish rituals like circumcision of boys, the public study of Torah, the ordination of teachers, and what have you. And did other things that aggrieved the Jewish community, such as on routine military campaigns in Egypt, would make a little stop by the Holy Temple in Jerusalem and raid the treasury to finance his military campaigns. These actions deeply aggravated the Maccabees and their followers. And so the Maccabees took up arms, not just against Antiochus and his armies, but then this is the part of the Hanukkah story that's rarely told. It was effectively a Jewish civil war, again, perpetrated or promoted by the fanatics against the assimilationists. I shudder to think what we would have been, where we would have fallen had we been forced to take sides if we were living at the time of the Maccabean uprising. We Reform Jews, that is. Because a lot of the Jews who were the targets of the military campaign of the Maccabees were Jews very much like you and me. They were basically secularists with some Jewish culture, as opposed to dyed-in-the-wool, Jews like today's Haredi. I mean, if you want to think about who the Maccabees were, you have to look to groups like the Taliban. They were absolutely hell-bent on their core conviction, which was, we have no king but God, which of course was sedition. It was treasonous to say that. So the Maccabees took up arms with that as their banner, that as their, and if you know anything from the last 50 years of world history, it's very dangerous to fight wars against radicalized religious zealots, right? If you watched the Iraq-Iran conflict, or the Russia-Afghanistan conflicts of the 1980s, you know what happens when you go to war against absolute hell-bent religious zealots. Generally, they just don't give up. And that's what happened with the Maccabees. They were, absolutely vicious in their guerrilla campaign, and eventually they prevailed. That inaugurated a long period of Hasmonean rule. So their family set up a religious dynasty that basically merged the offices of the high priest and the monarch. So the Hasmoneans were famous for restoring Jewish sovereignty to the land of Israel, and also for expanding the borders of biblical Israel to their largest territorial holdings since the rule of King David, the better part of 800-900 years prior. However, they are also known for their corruption. So their dynasty, which lasted about 100 years, included prominent monarchs and high priests who basically were in a kind of crony relationship, running the state without any checks or balances on their power. That's a very long digression, but I thought it would be relevant with Hanukkah right around the corner for you to get some of the background. And it is in that dynastic context that most of the teachers of chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot lived. So Nitai the Arbalite lived at around the very first part of the 1st century BCE. So right around the year 100 BCE, a century before the birth of Jesus, give or take. That's the time frame for this. You notice that these folks are not called rabbi because we don't have a class of teachers known as rabbis yet. And yet the rabbis who are writing Pirkei Avot centuries later, Pirkei Avot, remember, is compiled over a course of hundreds of years and is not finalized until the completion of the Mishna in the 230s CE. So we're talking 3 centuries and more since the guy lived, do we actually have his teaching in writing. But all of these teachings seem to be cherished and preserved with quite some attention to their fidelity. Now back to the content of the teaching itself. Nitai the Arbalite used to say, keep distance from an evil neighbor, do not become attached to the wicked, and do not abandon faith in divine retribution, or just punishment. It doesn't say divine, but the reader is to interpret that. As with many of these threefold maxims, a part of it feels a little bit off, right? And I think that one of these things is not like the other, at least on a cursory read. Number 3 does not on the surface seem to have anything to do with parts 1 and 2. So now here's where you get to play the part of rabbi. What is happening here? What does number 3 have to do with numbers 1 and 2? And what do numbers 1 and 2 have to do with the part of the teaching that we were looking at 2 weeks ago, which I've put up on the screen too? You notice that we have the pair announced first, Joshua ben Parachia and Nitai the Arbalite, who received the oral tradition from them, meaning these guys, Yossi ben Yoezer of Zereda and Yossi ben Yochanan of Jerusalem. So now you have another pair, the next in the chain of transmission, Joshua ben Parachia and Nitai the Arbalite. And then first they give the teaching associated with Joshua ben Parachia, who used to say, get yourself a teacher, acquire yourself a companion, and judge all people with the scale weighted in their favor, or give people the benefit of the doubt. Notice again, it's a threefold teaching where parts 1 and 2 seem to go together, and then 3 is a little bit of a surprise ending. And we talked about that last time. Go back and watch the video if you need to be reminded what we concluded about how number 3 connects. So very much the same format here. Now we're on to the second of the pair of teachers, Nitai the Arbalite. His teaching again, keep away from a bad neighbor, do not become attached to a wicked person, and do not abandon faith in divine retribution. So I'm going to just put the text off screen for a moment and ask you to chime in with what do you think is going on with this teaching? What does it have to do with the teachings that we looked at 2 weeks ago? Get yourself a teacher, acquire yourself a companion, and judge everyone favorably. In other words, give other people the benefit of the doubt. That was the teaching from 2 weeks ago. And now the next one sequentially is keep away from a bad neighbor, do not attach yourself to a wicked person, and do not despair of divine retribution. What's happening both in terms of how the text functions in its context, and also how does part 3 connect to parts 1 and 2 of this text? Trish, you're unmuted, so why don't you share?
I think the first 2 are talking about how to find that companion, which is helpful, or who not to choose as a companion. And the third one, to me, is like a direct parallel to the third in the previous section. It's really telling you who the ultimate judge is.
Okay, I like that a lot, by the way. Lovely. Good. Let's just kind of hold some of these thoughts in the shared space of our learning and invite others who wanted to comment here to do so. Let me add a frame that might help us. Recall that a couple of weeks ago, I invited us to think about the role of chavruta in the life of Jewish learning. Right, chavruta is the traditional format for Jewish study. Jewish study is not to be undertaken, say the rabbis, as a solitary exercise, but rather with a chaver. And now it's important, that's why both 2 weeks ago and today, we're spending a lot of time on this interesting word and all of its verb forms, chaver, which I told you means friend, but it comes from a verb meaning to connect or join. And there are all sorts of fun plays on words in Hebrew in general, and chaver is a word that can be twisted and turned and conjugated. So titchaber means to associate with or befriend, as in do not titchaber, do not associate with a rasha, a wicked person, in Nitai the Arbalite's teaching. Also, just as a fun little aside, if you have a packet of papers and you staple it together and you hand it out as a booklet, the word for a booklet in Hebrew is a choveret. Or when you were children in Hebrew school, you may have received a little blue book that you were supposed to write in to practice your letters. And the word on the front, does anyone remember the word on the front of those little blue books? Now, if you went to Hebrew school in the 1940s or 1950s or 1960s or 1970s, or as I did in the 1980s, you got one of these books. They've been around for that long. Does anyone remember what those books were called? The teacher would say, please, students, take out your Machberet. Very good. Now you know, if you break down the word machberet, the mem is a prefix that generally turns a word into a kind of noun form. So machberet comes from chaver. It's not that the book is your friend, it's that it's a collation. Anything that is collated, connected, joined, stapled, presented as a little booklet is a choveret or a machberet. So fun with words today. The point being, though, go back 2 weeks. Jewish study takes place in chavruta. It's pairs or small groups, right? You're not supposed to just sit alone with a book and figure it out by yourself. Jewish study is by definition communal, which is another challenge of doing Judaism in a pandemic, I think. That you have to go the extra mile to find your chaver or your chavera, female chaver, or your chavura, small group, chavura is a small group. Many synagogues have chavurot or chavuras. I know my mom's dad are part of a chavura. Many synagogues, by the way, started developing chavurot or chavuras in the late 1960s as an offshoot of other movements happening in society where, grown-ups were getting together in small groups to socialize. All of these words are connected. Anyway, 2 weeks ago, we learned that Jewish study is supposed to be done as a chavura. And it seems as if the rabbis are saying, go get yourself a friend. Let that person become your teacher and you become that person's teacher. And be sure to judge everyone generously. In other words, assume that you have something to learn from every other person. Nitai the Arbalite is the counterpoint, right? If we look at today's text, he's saying, but be careful. Not every person, even though you're supposed to judge everyone generously, think about how it connects to the last line from 2 weeks ago. Give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Nitai the Arbalite seems to be offering a riposte to Joshua ben Parachia. And he said, well, wait a minute, my friend. Not every person should be given the benefit of the doubt. You still have to keep your guard up. You don't want to associate with a no-goodnik, right? There are still people out there who are bad news. I gave a sermon on this many years ago, but one of the most powerful pieces of wisdom that was ever conveyed to me was as a boy, again, going back to my Hebrew school days. The principal of our religious school at Congregation Knesset Israel in Allentown, Pennsylvania, was a woman named Jeanette Eichenwald. And she was the daughter of Holocaust survivors. So that was, of course, I think the central part of her Jewish identity. And she would talk about her family's experience in the Shoah. And Jeanette said the following words to our class, which I've always held close. She says, show me who you go with, or tell me who you go with, and I'll tell you who you are. And the context in which she shared that, of course, is an answer to the question, how could so many quote unquote innocent Germans have gone along with what the Nazis were doing? And she said, show me or tell me who you go with and I'll tell you who you are. So the company we keep is very much a statement of our own priorities and identities. So I've always held that close, and I think it's related to Nitai the Arbalite, who says, keep distant from a bad neighbor. Do not attach yourself to a wicked person. And then the third part, which we're about to get to, do not despair of divine retribution. Do not lose hope in divine punishment. Obviously, I think it's intuitively logical to dissociate oneself from a bad neighbor. I mean, how many of you are, as parents, ever worried about a child's friends? My parents did. They did not want me hanging out with Devin Kiernan, who lived up the street. Sorry, Devin. Devin was the kid who would, somehow he was always playing with like matches and pocket knives when we were 6 and 5. It just became very clear that that was not the company that my folks wanted me to keep. Sorry, Devin, I shouldn't have used his last name. Don't Google him. I'm sure he's a great.
Start getting sound.
I'm sure he's a mensch.
How do I get sound?
Hang on. Okay, don't unmute yourself, folks. You get sound by turning the volume up on your computer, or if for some reason you can't hear me, try logging out and logging back in. Judy Gross, did you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I wanted to say that this also seems as though there has to be a certain bravery. You have to stand up for the goodness that who you are and who your friends are. And don't be afraid of retribution. And I didn't think of it as divine retribution. I thought of it as actually those other bad guys could be out to get you. But don't be afraid of that, because if you have a good team and you're together in goodness. And there's a certain, don't be a coward.
Great. And Judy, I mean, you're a teacher, so I'm sure that you've seen, the dynamics among people in classroom and how a very bright and talented young learner can nevertheless be swayed to the dark side by the wrong kind of companion. Anyone who is in a position of authority, if you watch how young learners develop, the company you keep really matters.
Absolutely. And who you sit with at the lunch table really matters. And if you're at the wrong lunch table, then you could be in trouble.
Great. Dad, comment.
it's going back to the third part of the three-part lesson. It's seeming to suggest that, well, if you thought that hanging out with bad people, you could get away with it, nothing was ever going to happen to you, then you might as well go along with the bad people since they seem to be doing pretty good. But the last part says, don't worry, they're going to get theirs.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. And maybe even more kind of rudimentary than that. There's this notion of, well, wait a minute, how come bad people are even around for me to choose from? Why isn't everybody, who wants to learn Torah a good person? The rabbis were living at a time, the rabbis who wrote the Mishna and composed Pirkei Avot, were living at a time where they were grappling with a sectarian debate that had roiled the Jewish community for centuries over the afterlife. And effectively, what we know from Josephus and other, I hesitate to call Josephus a historian, but he's as close to a historian as we have. I mean, obviously, you should read his Histories, name of his book, which is his account of the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, with hefty doses of salt. But one of the debates that Josephus records in his histories is between a group called the Pharisees and a group called the Sadducees. The Sadducees were priestly loyalists who, by the way, had been empowered throughout the Maccabean or throughout the Hasmonean dynasty that succeeded the Maccabean revolt. The Pharisees were teachers of the law who also were prominent at the time. Both groups figure, of course, quite prominently in the Gospels traditions, in the Christian scriptures, in the new, what Christians call the New Testament. Neither one, by the way, is a favored group, according to the Gospel writers. But if you really examine what we know about Jewish history from this centuries-long period, a century before the birth of Jesus to a century after Jesus walked the earth, we have a picture that kind of resolves into fuzzy but clear enough definition of a group that supported the priesthood and the rule of the priesthood to say, this is Jewish law, we are practicing it as the Bible tells us, and our word goes. And basically says, and then you have another group of the Pharisees who actually say, actually, you should follow our interpretation of the law. So the biggest divide between the Sadducees and the Pharisees is over written law versus oral law. The Pharisees are supporters of this idea of oral law or ongoing progressive revelation that they, as you see in Pirkei Avot, you know, by the way, which group prevails. The rabbis are directly indebted to the Pharisaic tradition of oral law. The subsidiary, the other big debate that seems to have divided these two communities, these two sects, as Josephus calls them, of Jews at the time. He identifies two other sects, by the way, just so you know. There's also the Essenes, this ascetic sect that seem to have hung out and taken a vow of chastity and poverty and priestly purity. And some people think they might have been associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls community. Maybe, maybe not. And finally, Josephus speaks of the Zealots, the Jews who took up arms against the Romans, possibly inspired by the Maccabees 2 centuries earlier. So now you have this group of Pharisees and Sadducees. The other debate that seems to concern them is over what happens once you die. And the Pharisees want to assure the people that there's an olam haba, there is a life to come, there's a world to come, that the righteous will inherit divine reward and the wicked will receive divine punishment or retribution. And that's where we get the tie into this text. It is a Pharisaic doctrinal core point that after you die, all of the scales of justice that were off kilter in your life of flesh and blood will be made right. So the Pharisees are very concerned with the question of theodicy, not the epic by Homer, not the Odyssey, but theodicy, Theodicy, which means God's justice. effectively, they're looking at the world around them and going, oh my God, there's war, there's famine, there's suffering, there's infighting, there's death, there's, the world looks a lot like 2020, but we're going back more than 2 centuries. And the rabbis are saying, how do we reconcile the world as it is with a God who is both omnipotent, all powerful, and also omnibeneficent, all good, or all just, more to the point. And they say, well, you got to wait till after you die. And then the good will get what they had coming and the bad will get what they had coming. And that seems to be where this ties in. And if you don't know that about the Pharisees, then a comment from Nitai the Arbalite saying, do not despair of divine retribution, is effectively a way of saying, don't concern yourself with the wicked right now. First of all, don't hang out with them. They're bad news. But secondly, don't worry too much about their fate, because God has it in for them. You do the right thing and God will reward you, whatever your earthly experience is. So there's a lot embedded in this text, and I wanted to point it out before we move on. Michelle.
Back to the original language, in the translation, the divine is bracketed. To what extent is it implicit in the language?
Well, again, that's a trick question, because if it's implicit, then it's not in the language. It's in the connotation. Generally, puranut, this interesting root word, which I believe is a loan word from Greek, but now I'm going to have to do my little etymological research on this interesting word puranut, which is not a Hebrew root form. It's a pei, resh, vav, yud, nun, vav, nun. It's a weird word. Hebrew roots tend to be 3 letters, and you can pretty easily figure out what they are. Puranut, at least to my less trained eye, looks like a Greek loan word. So I'd have to go back and see, is there any actual, not just connotation, but literal sense to puranut that implies divine retribution. But in the way it's used in rabbinic literature, almost always. There are other words for the kinds of punishments that are ordained by people in courts. So that's the key point. When you use the word puranut, my non-scientific, but I have enough experience reading this literature to tell you that in my experience, when you see puranut, you almost always go to divine punishment, as opposed to the kind of punishment inflicted by a court or imposed by a court. Karen Levin.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because I was very interested in what you were just talking about. So my statement kind of goes back to the text that we just read, and some comments that Judy said about don't be a coward. So to me, when I read this sign about don't hang out with really bad people, that what happens here is not just one person, it becomes what we call today a group think. Mm-hmm. You start out with one and you get sucked into a larger thought process that wasn't really yours in the first place, but yet you want to go along with this idea for whatever reasons, whether it's a fear or lack of not being a coward. You have to, and then so to balance that out, you have this piece of don't worry about divine retribution here. So I was thinking that possibly in the day that this was written and discussed, it happens all the time with all human nature. There's those who have the real alpha people in the group and can really grab you so that this is the bad person and don't hang out with them, and catch it right away.
Yeah, that's kind of a cautionary tale about the seductive power of the demagogue and demagoguery. And I think that if you want to, kind of see this in action, just look at the world right now. And the power of a demagogue to control the thoughts and actions of a mob, or to influence the thought and action of a mob. So now you can see that these 2 texts back to back, the one from Joshua ben Parachia, this famous teaching, appoint yourself a teacher, acquire yourself a companion, and judge all people favorably. And then his companion, Nitai the Arbalite's comment, keep distance from an evil neighbor, do not become attached to the wicked, and do not abandon faith in divine punishment, are actually pretty much exact companion pieces to each other, or complements, though opposites. right? One says, look, it's up to you to find the person who will teach and inspire and be your chaver in the course of your Jewish learning. But be careful, Nitai says, because you got to choose that person wisely. So they really function as a unit. And I hope that if it wasn't obvious when we started today, it's obvious now. Let's move on. A new pair of teachers. Just starting in the Hebrew, Yehuda ben Tabai, Shimon ben Shatach, Kibelu Mehem. Again, another pair of learners from the 1st century BCE, teachers from the 1st century BCE. They don't have the title rabbi yet. That will not happen until post-Jesus time. It's interesting that in the Christian literature, in the Gospels, Jesus is called rabbi by his disciples. Therefore, you get the impression that at least by the middle of the 1st century CE, which is the Pauline tradition, when the Apostle Paul was writing and distributing his kind of PR on behalf of his buddy Jesus, whom he claims was both crucified and resurrected. If you're using the word rabbi in association with Jesus at that time, it suggests that that had become the common term for a teacher of Jewish tradition. So middle of the 1st century, but now we're 150 years earlier than that. And they do not have the title rabbi. This pair received the oral tradition from them. Who are them? These guys, Joshua ben Parachia and Nitai the Arbalite, direct chain. Judah ben Tabai, let's hear a teaching from the first of the pair. Judah ben Tabai said, do not play the part of an advocate. Now, the bracket is helpful and yet maybe too helpful. So in the Hebrew, Yehuda ben Tabai Omer, Judah ben Tabai says, Al ta'as atzmecha, do not make yourself ke'orchei hadayanim, like those who are lawyers. And the gloss on this, that is the generally accepted interpretation of this text, is that if you are the judge, and remember the role of the rabbi was to adjudicate. Remember I told you 2 weeks ago that on my ordination certificate is language that comes directly from the Talmud, which says Yoreh Yoreh Yadin Yadin. It's the 4 words that qualify me, as it were, in Jewish tradition to be a rabbi. May this one teach? Yoreh, Yoreh, he may teach. Yadin, may this one judge, play the part of judge for the Jewish community. May this one adjudicate matters of Jewish law and practice. Yadin, he may judge. Yoreh, Yoreh, may he teach, he may teach. Yadin, Yadin, may he judge, he may judge. That's the qualifying statement for rabbis. And it's used even in the Reform movement's smicha certificate, my certificate of ordination. So with that in mind, recognizing that rabbis are being trained to be judges and teachers, in your role as judge, the text says, do not be a lawyer. There's a difference between a judge and a lawyer. And when the litigants are standing before you, the text continues, look upon them as if they were both guilty. But when they leave your presence, look upon them as if they were both innocent when they have accepted the judgment. And now Her Honor, Carole Princer Levy. Can you share with our class today a little bit about your work as a judge and your role and where you served, and does this text resonate with you? I'm asking you to comment not academically, but personally. But you have to unmute yourself for that to happen.
Okay, basically look at the words advocate and judge. Advocate, you take a side. A judge, you're neutral. And the judge's role, in my opinion, is to be completely neutral. Our law does not view you as guilty. Our law views you as innocent, I do believe. And you don't have one feeling for one and one feeling for the other.
How did you become a judge?
Well, in what way? Technically?
No, I mean, what were you doing beforehand? One doesn't just start.
I was a prosecutor.
Exactly.
I was a prosecutor. And you have to put that aside when you you sit there. But I will tell you that little tricks come into your head as you see them in front of you. I mean, there are certain ways to present cases, there are certain views, and you know how to do it. So you apply those to your judgment. And it is very difficult often to figure out what is the correct decision. Sometimes you can do it from the bench, other times you have to reserve because you have to really go and look at all the evidence which is necessary to prove a case. And you have to dismiss a case if there's no evidence. One of the classic cases for me is when I was a prosecutor, I prosecuted juvenile delinquents. And in White Plains, the mall had a lot of petty thefts. And one day I had a case where a child literally stole a sandwich. And I guess he was hungry. And the store detective saw him, chased him into the men's room. But when he got into the men's room, there was no sandwich. So the child had either eaten the sandwich or had thrown it away. And I go in court and I say, you can't prosecute this to the store. And they said, we have to prosecute it. It's to deter future theft. Well, if your client says you have to go, you go. So I go and the judge looks at me and I present the case and she says, and may I see the evidence? Where is the sandwich? And I said, well, Your Honor, there is no sandwich. So she said to me, leading me, do you have an application? Which says to me, withdraw the case, counselor. So you must have evidence. And then your job is to determine whether that evidence is valid.
Thank you so much. Do you find that this text, by the way, resonates with you? I mean, is this sound advice for judges?
Well, I don't view everybody as guilty.
Great. I was hoping you'd pick up on that.
Well, that's why I said it depends on the definitions and also how you view it. Our law says everybody is innocent until proven guilty.
Right. I think probably the bigger takeaway is that you could interpret it to mean look at the case as if both could be guilty, but once justice has been served, regard both as if they are now innocent in the eyes of the law. In other words, once the sentence has been served, there should be no further punishment exacted. Carole, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So back to the text. I don't know if there's anything more to say on this because it's actually one of the more straightforward texts. And again, notice that it's just from a format standpoint, it's the same threefold maxim. Do not, when you are judging, play the part of a lawyer. When the litigants are standing before you, look upon them as if they were both guilty. And when they leave your presence, look upon them as if they were both innocent. So it's, again, three components to the single teaching. We move on. The second teacher of the pair is a guy named Shimon ben Shetach, or Shimon ben Shatach, as he's sometimes his name is vocalized Shatach, sometimes Shetach. It's one of the idiosyncrasies of classical Hebrew. It's the same reason that the word for a grapevine is a geffen, but when you're praying the Kiddush, you say Berei Pri Hagafen. It's one of those just funny things. So Shimon ben Shetach is one of my favorite teachers. I spent much of my Yom Kippur sermon this year talking about Shimon ben Shetach. So if you didn't remember the name, he's the guy who was struggling in the cotton business and his students buy him a donkey. This is one of the more famous stories about Shimon ben Shetach. And they buy him a donkey so that he can sell his wares more efficiently and therefore have more time to teach Torah. They buy him this donkey. They find that there's a jewel in the saddlebag. The donkey was sold to them by a Gentile merchant who did not know that there was a jewel being sold. He demands that his disciples return the jewel. They say, why should we bother? This guy is just a Gentile. He's not one of us. Shimon ben Shetach says, who do you think I am, a barbarian? And that's the end of the story. And I talked a lot about how we see people who are different from ourselves. Do we see them as kin, as brother, or do we see them as foreigner, as other. And that was really what I used that story as my preaching text. But Shimon ben Shetach has a lot of teachings associated with him. And here is, that one actually does not come from Pirkei Avot. The one I used on Yom Kippur comes from the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Talmud Yerushalmi, not the Babylonian Talmud, the lesser of the two Talmuds, I guess. Shimon ben Shetach used to say, be thorough in the interrogation of witnesses. Carole, I think, alluded to that. Be careful with your words, lest from them they learn to lie. Kind of a threefold teaching. It's a little bit, the last part is really, it's really 1, 2, 2 prime. So, Heve marbe lachkor et haedim. Do everything you can to, lachkor literally means to dig, to shovel out, to dig down with your edim. Edim are witnesses. Veheve zahir bidvarecha. Be very careful what you say. Again, all of this assumes that you are in the role of judge. Measure your words carefully. Shema mitocham yilmedu l'shaker. Because you are not only adjudicating a case, you are modeling behavior. Presume, and from them, they learn to lie is interesting. I don't know whether they mean the witnesses or the litigants and their counsel. It's interesting to conjecture who the they might be in this case. I don't have an answer. Diane, do you want to comment? Just unmute yourself kindly.
I took that to mean that you should not, you shouldn't lead the witness. In other words, don't put words in his mouth so he figures out what to say.
Nice. I think that's a very plausible read, by the way. I totally buy that. And I'm sorry that people couldn't see you. I spotlighted myself, but I can remove the spotlight so that if there are any other speakers who would like to raise a hand or comment here, you may. So I think that what's interesting here is just we're learning a lot about the role of rabbi in the ancient community as judge. And it seems that even before rabbis were called rabbis, this was a prominent feature of the way in which Jewish life was organized and conducted, that there was an authority who was both the master of Jewish law, the teacher, the master teacher for the community, who was also expected to adjudicate matters of Jewish law. It makes perfect sense if you think about it to be both teacher and judge, because ours is both a legal and a scholarly tradition. So you would want the people who are most conversant in the law to be the ones deciding cases where the law or a matter of law is in dispute. Let's go to our next pair, section 10. Shemaiah and Abtalion. So this is an interesting pair of teachers. The traditions around Shemaiah and Abtalion, again, 1st century BCE, are that they were both converts. I don't know if that has any bearing on the content of their teaching, but it's noteworthy. So when you read about Shemaiah and Abtalion, they, by the way, are particularly cherished teachers in Jewish tradition. There's just a whole lot of love for Shemaiah and Abtalion, but it's interesting to note that they are both referred to as converts as well throughout other places in the literature. Shemaiah and Abtalion kiblu mehem. They received the tradition from them, meaning Shimon ben Shetach and Judah ben Tabai, the previous pair. We're just going straight down the line, pair to pair to pair to pair. Chavura to chavura to chavura, right? Or, sorry, chavruta to chavruta to chavruta. Shemaiah, the first of the pair, said, love work, ohev atamalacha, love, literally like manual labor is this kind of work. Love your job. Usena et harabanut. This would be a pun, by the way. Rabbanut, literally in today's modern Israeli Hebrew, means the rabbinic authority. So hate the rabbanut, hate the rabbinic authority, but that's not really what's meant here. Do not embrace so much the role of rabbi that it's all about rav. There's a lot of wordplay happening here. The word rav is the word that means rabbi in Hebrew, or rabbi, my rav. A rav is a teacher, but rav is also a word that means big or great or impressive. even in biblical Hebrew. For instance, when it tells us in Exodus chapter 15 that the Israelites went free from Pharaoh and his armies drowned in the Red Sea, it tells us that a mixed multitude went with the Jewish captives. And the word for mixed multitude, or the phrase, is Erev Rav. Literally, Erev is something that's mixed up. It's also the word for evening. You're getting a lot of Hebrew wordplay today. Why is Erev, evening, something that's mixed up? Because it is halfway between day and night. It's neither one nor the other. It's Erev. Erev Sukkot, the mixed up time between the day before and the onset of Sukkot. So Erev is when Jewish holidays begin, when the sunlight is mixed with darkness. So Erev Rav, a mixed multitude. Rav means something big or great. And it also means rabbi, it means teacher. So there's this delicious wordplay here, hate the rabbanut, which literally means hate the part of being a rabbi, or shun or denounce the aspect of being a rabbi that is about being superior. I wouldn't say sana, it's not like hate, it's more at shun or beware of the dimension of rabbinic authority that is all about power and authority and ego. So there's a lot inside of that, and I hope you'll take a few moments to think about it and comment. And then the third part of the teaching is ve'al titvada l'rashut, and do not, and speaking of authority, do not cozy up to. Titvada literally means to take counsel with, but I like the words cozy up to. Do not cozy up to the ruling authority, meaning the presumably the secular power, the monarch, or possibly the Roman state. It's hard to know because I don't know when Shammai and Avtalion were alive, if they were specifically speaking about the relationship between the Jewish community and the empire. Because obviously, even during the period of the Hasmonean dynasty, which again was Jewish sovereignty restored in the land of Israel, though it was short-lived, it was eventually overthrown by the Roman authorities, turning Judea into a vassal state effectively, and making the procurator, or the Roman appointed governor, the local authority. The most famous of which is a guy named Herod. Before the time of Jesus, we know a lot about Herod. He too was a convert, by the way, or came from a family of converts, whose Jewish status was dubious and was always a thorn in his side, that the Jewish community didn't really fully accept him as Jewish, but he tried to do things to appease or suck up to the Jews, like building elaborate public works projects like the temple. The temple was completely reconstructed under Herod. So when we think of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, that was Herod's doing, but it was largely a vanity project to curry favor with the Jews, who never really accepted Herod as one of their own. So the point here is that toward the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, imperial power once again asserts itself in the region, and Jews have to act not only in relationship to one another as a Jewish community, but also in relationship to a much more powerful governing authority. And there seems to be, at least in my read of Shammai and Avtalion here, a real caution about not sucking up too much or cozying up too much to the non-Jewish authorities. That's at least my read on this, and I probably would have to do some more research to corroborate or kind of change my speculation. Dad, comment.
I wanted to take a much less political spin on this, just to say it's three good pieces of advice about how to get along in the workplace.
Yeah.
You know, put your nose to the grindstone. Don't act like you know it all and you're the boss, and don't suck up.
It's great. It's so great. Speaking from my own very modest position of authority in a Jewish community, I will both hear and heed what you see in this text. It's really good advice for anyone who serves in any work or leadership capacity. It also is interesting, the whole idea about love labor, that opening part of the threefold teaching here is important because rabbis remember, and I think I said this 2 weeks ago, so I apologize that we have to do so much remembering what we already know, but that's important, and that's why I'm here. Remember that rabbis are not paid for being rabbis, not until the end of the 19th century, right? That's a European norm that is basically stolen from Protestant clergy. That is not indigenous to Judaism, I would say. The idea of paid clergy is really, really new in Jewish history. So, I mean, obviously it's normative now in all denominations of Judaism. I think even in the Haredi world, though I do not speak from any position of knowledge or authority on this, I think the rabbis for the Haredi community are basically taken care of financially by the community. But for most of Jewish history, rabbis had other jobs. They, if they could own land, they worked in agriculture. If they could run a business, they ran a business. More often, they were in more menial forms of labor. Many of them were tavern owners and wine sellers and worked in money lending, like the things Jews throughout Europe did. So they went into the family shmata business. So I think the idea is also, don't get so high and mighty in your rabbinic role that you neglect your need to make a living for yourself and your family. So that's part of the context for this teaching as well. Anything else on Shemaiah and Avtalion here? Well, that was Shemaiah. We'll look at Avtalion in a moment. Somebody else put a question that goes way back to something we already covered. So, okay, let's go to our text. And his partner Avtalion. Now you're really getting the pattern here, which is why I say, after next week, you can keep reading Pirkei Avot, and then you'll really then we'll rock it through this when we get back in. Post-Pesach, by the way, I'll be resuming our study throughout the Omer between Pesach and Shavuot, Passover and Shavuot this spring. Once I'm back from sabbatical, we'll have a nice opportunity to reconnect with our Mishna. All right, Avtalion used to say, sages, there should be a comma, that's a direct address. Chachamim, and you see it's actually in the Hebrew, right here. Avtalion Omer, Chachamim, wise people, sages, Hizharu bidvarecha, b'divrechem. Sages, be careful with your words. There's a lot of this. There's a lot of recognition in these texts around the power of the rabbinic word. So sages, be careful with what you say, lest you incur the penalty of exile. Shema tachuvu chovat galut, or golas in Yiddishized Hebrew. Galut means exile, diaspora. Fascinating that the rabbis are already attentive to that Jewish circumstance. Be careful what you say, or you might end up being kicked out of the community. V'tiglu limkom mayim haraim, and be carried off to a place of evil waters. V'yishtu hatalmidim habaim achreihem v'yamutu. And then the disciples who follow you will drink of those evil waters and die. And finally, the third part, remember this is a 3-part teaching, kind of. And thus the name of heaven will become profaned. But instead of being 3 separate teachings, this is, if you do this, then this will happen. And as a result, that will happen. A will lead to B, will lead to C. As opposed to, hey everyone, A and B and C. Still kind of a 3-fold teaching. Avtalion seems a little bit less faithful to the formula. Nevertheless, it's a really interesting teaching. What's happening here? What does he mean? Be careful with your words, lest you incur the penalty of exile. And penalty here is not the same word as punishment, divine retribution, puranut. It's chovat. Literally, it means an obligation. Chovah is that which is incumbent upon a person. So you will tachuvu chovat galut. You will be saddled with or burdened with the responsibility of being in exile, and you will be cast out to a place of evil waters. And then your sages will, your pupils will drink of them. Those who come after you will drink of them, and they will die. And the name of God will end up profaned. Really weird text. Alan Markowitz, why don't you take a crack at it?
My opinion is that the sage should speak with the words of purity, because if the opposite of purity is polluted, and they're using this image of bad waters, evil waters, as being exiled to an environment of pollutants. And of
Right.
course, if his disciples follow and go to an area of a polluted area, they will die.
Right. So you, I think, like I, by the way, read this text as an allegory. We're not talking about actually being exiled to another land where the waters are polluted. We're talking about ill-chosen words as a pollutant to metaphorical water. And what is often likened to water in Jewish tradition? Probably the most common analog to water, when water is used in a metaphorical concept or metaphorical frame in Judaism,
Words,
what is likened to water?
words, speech.
Speech and words, but specifically which words?
Torah.
Torah. Torah is often likened to water. And remember, the rabbis are holding up a long-held Pharisaic notion of oral law, which means that they have to own some of their responsibility for how the law gets interpreted. And if you're not just going to go with the letter of the law in the 5 books of Moses, but you're going to add to it your own rabbinic interpretation, then there have to be all sorts of caveats and checks and balances, right? You have to be very careful how you speak, because you as the rabbi, as the arbiter of Jewish law, as the teacher and judge of Torah, you have the ability, the power, the authority to keep Torah pure or to corrupt it. And your words could pollute the waters, right? Your words, the waters where waters is Torah. That's how I read this text. I think that it's drawing upon a very prominent metaphor in a wider Jewish context. And if you know that context, then you see the word water and you go, do we mean actual water here, or do we mean the living water of Torah? Now, that is not the only metaphor that applies to Torah. The other famous one is a tree. We know that from the book of Proverbs. Eitz chaim hi lemachazikim ba. It is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it, and all who cling to it find happiness. It is more precious than rubies. So that's another metaphor for Torah. Torah is like a treasure of glittering jewels. But I think that if you look at all of Torah and rabbinic tradition together, the most often used metaphor to describe Torah is water. Torah as living waters. Something that, like water, is required for life, required for spiritual sustenance, or maybe even physical sustenance if you're thinking about the Jewish people as a living collective. Without Torah, we will die of thirst. And that's what basically is happening here. It's not saying without Torah, it's saying if you as rabbis misuse your authority, misspeak when it comes to Torah, provide interpretations of the law that corrupt the source, it is like polluting the well. And the result will be that your disciples will drink of it and they will die. But it's even worse than that, because there's a third level of punishment, or there's a third level of consequence, right? The first is that your disciples will drink of the same waters that you polluted with your ill-chosen words. They will suffer and die. What's the third consequence? Remember back to the text. The last part. Here it is. V'nimtza shem shamayim mitchalel. And as a result, v'nimtza means, and you will find that shem shamayim, the name of heaven, which is a euphemism for God, will be mitchalel, from chilul, not halel with a hey, which means praised. The opposite of Hallel is Chalel with a chet. It will be profaned. It will be a profound injury and insult to the very name of God. So there's a lot at stake here. God's name is at stake. God's reputation in the world is at stake. All because you rabbis have the power to interpret the law. And by the way, this teaching comes to mind whenever I see or hear a rabbi anywhere teaching in a way that I believe perverts the Jewish tradition. So when you hear, for instance, as was the case 15 years ago after Hurricane Katrina, there was a rabbi in Israel who was like, I think the chief rabbi of Israel, who said the real reason that Katrina hit was because of rampant homosexuality in New Orleans, and this was divine punishment. In my view, there's no substantiation for that kind of thinking anywhere in Judaism. And that's the kind of teaching that I believe both poisons the well of Torah, infects the disciples and the followers of that rabbi, and ultimately profanes the very name of God. So there's a lot at stake here, but don't just think of this as an abstract case or something that's only about Judaism 2,000 years ago. Dad, you've had your hand up for a bit, and Joe Levine, you've had your microphone unmuted. So let's go Doug and then Joe.
I see that Barbara and I shared the same thought, that this was an evocation of the Babylonian exile.
Probably. And that's important too, that the rabbis do have a deeply internalized trauma. And at this point, look, the rabbis, you got to take this at two layers. The speakers of the text, Shemaiah and Avtalion, are living before the destruction of the temple. So the only exile that's part of their Jewish memory is the Babylonian exile. And that is not a lightly chosen term. Jews know what exile is and what it does to a community. And it is I would say, principal trauma of Jewish life, at least since the slavery in Egypt, which does not have the kind of historical grounding that the Babylonian exile does. I mean, there's mountains of actual physical, archaeological, and textual evidence for a Babylonian exile in ways that there does not exist for the Egyptian slavery and exodus. The rabbis who are writing Avot, the rabbis who are writing the Mishna, not only are aware of the Babylonian exile and may be quoting Shemaiah and Avtalion faithfully, but they also carry a second exile, which is much more prominent in their memory because some of them lived through it, or their parents or their teachers lived through it, which was the exile that followed. They actually lived through two more exiles. There was the exile following the destruction of Jerusalem and eventually the fall of Masada. So during the Jewish uprising, the Judean War against Rome from 70 to 74, or 67 and 74, when the Jews rebelled against Rome and lost. And that's the famous image of Jews being carted off in chains that's on the Arch of Titus. And then again, in the failed Bar Kokhba rebellion in the year 135. So, and the Mishnah was written after both of those. So for the rabbi, and I'm really glad you brought this up, Dad, for the writers of the Mishnah, you've got threefold exile as the signature traumas of the Jewish people. So they know about which they speak. And they use this word very deliberately to explain that I think they're not only talking about spiritual exile, now that I think about it, because they have to be choosing these words carefully, and they believe in divine retribution, both in the here and now and in the hereafter. And so I think that they are making a strong case that misused rabbinic authority can result in spiritual exile, but also physical exile. Jews no longer deserving to have a place to call their own. Wonderful. Joe, do you want to make an additional comment?
Just had a question. I saw the word galut, and I was wondering if it had any connection with the English word galut for me when people say
like he's a big galut.
Yeah.
The answer is I do not know. But that's the kind of fun wordplay inquiry that, when I'm supposed to be like writing my bar mitzvah speech for weekend. Instead, I'll be Googling galut. I will Google galut etymology and I'll let you know what I find. In the meantime, I do not know. Barbara, wrote in the chat, could that have to do with exile, bitter waters of Babylon? Yeah, great. There's a psalm that talks about by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. That's Psalm 137 in the Bible. So yeah, sure. Exile and bitter waters are also associated in Jewish memory. Often because Jewish exile required that we would leave our home and cross a body of water. Michelle Braun makes this tantalizing comment about being a cult leader. Yeah, right. There's a fine line between being a legitimate religious authority and being a cult leader, and it probably is in the eye of the various beholders. So it's a good question. And somebody else, Steve wrote, isn't this what led to Spinoza's downfall in Amsterdam? Well, okay, now you're jumping 1600 years forward, or 1300 years from the completion of the Mishnah. You know, Spinoza was, yeah, in a sense, but Spinoza wasn't a rabbi. So did Spinoza misuse rabbinic authority? He was a Talmud prodigy. He was a learned Jew. And it was believed that he was a danger to the Jewish community because of what he taught about the nature of God and the universe. Such views were deemed heretical by the ruling rabbinic authorities of his time. So I think you have to just be very careful that you qualify. Not every person who has spoken up and been harshly judged by his contemporaries or the rabbinic authorities is necessarily a person who misused his position of power. There you go. Galut comes from the Middle Dutch, meaning galley slave, galiut. Well, there you go. I love that. I will have to find ways to use that. Let us continue and do at least one more Mishnah, see what we can get done today. Because we're going to get to the most famous pair of teachers in the pre-rabbinic tradition. So I want to end with Hillel and Shammai. And this is really an extraordinary teaching. One of, I think, the most lovely and important in Jewish life. Hillel v'Shammai kiblu mehem. So finally we get to Hillel and Shammai, and it's a long chain of pairs of tradition, right? We started with Moses, Joshua, elders, prophets, men of the great assembly, Simon the righteous, Antigonus of Socho, and now pairs. Yossi ben Yoezer and Yochanan of Jerusalem. We skipped over this one. This is Yossi ben Yochanan, Joshua ben Parachia and Nittai the Arbelai, Judah ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach, Shemaiah and Avtalion, and finally, the most famous pre-rabbinic pair of teachers, Hillel and Shammai, received the oral tradition from them, from Shemaiah and Avtalion. I love this, by the way. The two most famous names in the pre-rabbinic teaching tradition learned their Torah from converts. Just remember that. There is a long tradition of upholding and even glorifying, venerating the place of the convert in Jewish life. The other most famous place is the treatment in the rabbinic literature of Ruth, who joined herself, the rabbis would say, by way of conversion to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and ended up becoming a progenitor mother figure to none other than King David, and through King David to the Messiah himself. So converts have a place of esteem in the Jewish tradition. Hillel and Shammai learned from a convert, or learned from converts. Hillel used to say, be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving humankind or mankind, and drawing them, meaning other people, close to the Torah. And by the way, we break the pattern in the next text, just so you see it. That's where we'll get to next week. Hillel also used to say, and then the one after that, he also used to say. So Hillel has such an important place that before we jump to his companion Shammai, who is clearly the foil to Hillel, as opposed to these other pairs where it seems like both part A of the pair, Shemaiah, and part B of the pair, Avtalion, for instance, have equal weight in the transmission of the tradition. When it comes to Hillel and Shammai, it's very clear from the get-go that Hillel is the one from whom we learn, and Shammai is merely his foil, often the one from whom we learn in negative inference, like don't do what Shammai teaches, usually. But his points of view are always important because they become teaching tools for understanding why Hillel is deemed to be the one who is right. Hillel and Shammai received the tradition from Shammai and Avtalion. Hillel used to say, Hevei mitalmidav shel Aharon, be like the students or be of the disciples of Aaron, Ohev shalom verodev shalom, loving peace and pursuing peace. Ohev et habriot, loving God's creatures, umekorvan la Torah, and drawing them close to Torah. Michelle Braun, comment, question.
Thank you. Okay, so you spent a good bit of ink here setting up the tradition, the chain of, or I'm sorry, rope through the generations to, you know, who they learn from and the connections.
Right.
For the pre-rabbis and the rabbis, since also being a cynic, I want to suggest that the disciples of Aaron refers back to the priesthood, but the rabbis themselves are not.
Yeah, and by the way, wonderful point. Sadducee, that's a word I used earlier, but did not define. Similarly, Pharisee. I'll start with Pharisee. Pharisee in Hebrew is, Pharisees, plural, in Hebrew are perushim. Literally, perush means to interpret. So perushim are the interpreters, those who take the law as it is in writing and interpret it. And the tradition of Pharisaism directly becomes the rabbinic method of interpreting the law. Sadducee, in contrast, in Hebrew is tzadokim, those who are the followers of Tzadok, or a guy that you may have heard pronounced in the anglicized form, Zadok. Zadok was a Kohen. And the Tzadokim, or the Sadducees, the Tzadokim, were the followers of Zadok, or Zadok, the priest. Who was Zadok the priest? He was the authority who claimed direct lineage from Aharon, from Aaron, the high priest. In other words, the Sadducees, remember I said they are the priestly loyalists, and they claim direct ancestry from Zadok through, or from Aaron through Zadok. So that is a really important point, that Aaron is the archetypal priestly figure, and the rabbis are actually, in some ways, anti-priesthood. If you really dig down, the growth of the rabbinate is directly indebted to the Pharisees who dissent from the Sadducees. And yet at the same time, the Sadducees are so tied up in institutional authority that somehow the rabbis, I think, have to get around that problem and not diminish the stock of Aaron too much. In other words, Aaron is already a venerated primary figure in Jewish mythology by the time the rabbis are writing. And we're now writing 1,000 years, 1,500 years after Aaron the priest. There's no way to say we don't venerate Aaron. Aaron himself is a highly problematic figure in Torah literature. And this idea of Aaron as the lover of peace may be expressed with a bit of a wink, because Aaron so loves peace that his signature foible, his signature failing, is related to his desire to keep the peace and make the peace. In other words, well, what is Aaron's signature failing as a leader?
Golden calf.
It's the episode of the golden calf, exactly. And remember that the golden calf doesn't start with Aaron. It starts with an angry and anxious mob who say, that man Moses, we don't know what has happened to him. When Moses is up on Mount Sinai for a day, becomes a week, becomes 3 weeks, becomes 40 days and 40 nights, the people rebel and they say, we don't know what happened to Moses. We need a sign that God is among us. And they approach Aaron, and Aaron says, okay, here's the plan. Take off your gold jewelry, we'll melt it down. And they build this golden calf. Here is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. I mean, it's a huge disaster for the Jewish people at the time. So Aaron's love and pursuit of peace is truly a double-edged sword in Jewish lore. Other thoughts on be of the disciples of Aaron? Well, then it's a fine way for us to end, isn't it? Because I would like to suggest that the ultimate aim of Torah study is to bring more shalom into the world. And it's interesting that this text comes as almost like a refreshing intermezzo after all of these cautionary tales about the dangers of rabbinic authority. Here you have a Hillel who, like a breath of fresh air, comes along and says, let's take a step back from all of the pitfalls and perils of being a master teacher and judge, and all of the dangers that come with wielding authority in this context. I think Hillel boils it down to its essence. He says, what your real job is, and remember, he's giving this advice, or his advice is being framed in a handbook for rabbis about how to be a rabbi. That's Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is the original master text on how to be a rabbi. What Hillel is saying is, when it all boils down, your main job is to increase shalom in the world and increase the love of Torah in the world. That's what you have to do. And when you do that, you bring people closer to the root, to the source of living waters, and ultimately you bring people closer to God. So it's quite a beautiful, I think, coda to some of the harsher and more cautionary texts that we've looked at today. That what I think what Hillel is in touch with is the life-affirming, peace-pursuing, love-fulfilling dimensions of being a teacher of Torah. And all I want to say by way of concluding for today, other than what a privilege I feel it is to teach Torah with you and to learn Torah both with and from you, is that I really hope that in these times that are so anxious and disturbing and traumatizing, I hope that you will feel that our own efforts to study Torah and live Torah and nourish ourselves from the waters of Torah have increased your own internal sense of shalom, maybe have helped you be an instrument of shalom in your relationships and in your lives, and have brought you closer in love to one another and to God. So I don't want us to lose sight of the deep, sacred, life-affirming, love-fulfilling, peace-pursuing mission that we're on here. It's important sometimes to take a step back from the granular level at which we approach these texts, and close reading is important. But let's just stand in appreciation of what Hillel reminds us today. And God bless you all. Thank you.
Yasher Koyach.
Thank you.
Kol hakavod, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yasher Koyach.
Amen.
Amen. I look
Thank
forward
you.
to seeing many of you tonight at the mid-year check-in. Your presence there would be very meaningful. We want people with all sorts of perspectives to share. It's really my hope that the content will be more love-affirming than belly-aching. But you know, people are allowed to share the things that are bothering them too. We can hear it. So, see you soon. Be well, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.